The town of Meadowbrook sat nestled in the rolling hills of the Midwest, surrounded by endless fields and dotted with pockets of lush forest. On the surface, it was the kind of place that seemed pulled from a postcard. Children rode bikes along quiet streets, families gathered for picnics in the town square, and the church bells rang every Sunday morning. But like so many picturesque towns, Meadowbrook had secrets. The Iron Hounds, a notorious biker gang, had made Meadowbrook their stronghold. What had begun as a nuisance had grown into an oppressive force. The gang operated with impunity, demanding protection fees from small businesses, intimidating residents, and ensuring that anyone who dared resist paid a steep price. The local sheriff, Harold Mackey, seemed powerless, or perhaps unwilling, to do anything about it. Ethan Blake was not a man who sought attention. A former Army Ranger, he had settled in Meadowbrook 3 years ago after retiring from the military. A combat injury had left him with a noticeable limp, a jagged scar running down his left leg, a souvenir from a mission gone wrong. Ethan had come to Meadowbrook seeking peace and anonymity. As the town's park ranger, he spent his days patrolling the trails, maintaining campsites, and making sure the forest's beauty was preserved for the town to enjoy. It was during one of his early morning rounds that Ethan first noticed the new family in town. The Connors had recently taken over the small bakery on Main Street. It was a modest place, with faded paint on the shutters and a cheerful hand-painted sign above the door that read, "Sweet Beginnings." Ethan admired their courage. Starting fresh in a town like this took guts, especially with the Iron Hounds casting their shadow over every business. The trouble began just a week after the Connors opened shop. Ethan had stopped by the diner for coffee, as he did every morning, when he saw 3 members of the Iron Hounds swagger into the bakery. Through the diner's large windows, Ethan observed their leader, a wiry man with a snake tattoo curling around his neck, speaking with Tom Connor, the bakery owner. The conversation grew heated, and when Ethan saw Tom's wife clutching their young son close, his jaw tightened. "They're at it again," muttered Marla Torres, the diner's owner, as she refilled Ethan's coffee. "New folks don't last long if they don't play along." Ethan looked up at Marla. "Protection fees?" She nodded grimly. "They call it that, but we all know what it really is. Extortion. Pay up, or they break something. Your windows, your kneecaps, your spirit. Sheriff Mackey never seems to be around when they come knocking." Ethan said nothing, his eyes following the gang members as they left the bakery and strutted back to their motorcycles. He could see the tension in Tom's shoulders, the defeated slump of a man trying to protect his family while calculating the cost. Later that day, Ethan found himself back at the bakery. The smell of freshly baked bread greeted him as he stepped inside. Tom Connor was behind the counter, his smile strained but polite. "Afternoon, Ranger Blake. Can I help you with anything?" Ethan leaned on the counter, his gaze steady. "I saw what happened this morning." Tom hesitated, glancing toward the kitchen where his wife and son were working. "It's nothing. Just a misunderstanding." Ethan tilted his head slightly. "Didn't look like nothing." Tom sighed, his shoulders sagging. "They want $1,000 a month. Said it's for protection. I told them we don't need protection, but they wouldn't take no for an answer." "You call the sheriff?" Ethan asked, though he already knew the answer. Tom shook his head. "And what good would that do? Everyone knows Sheriff Mackey looks the other way. I'm not about to risk making things worse." Ethan nodded, his expression neutral. "Let me know if you change your mind." Tom gave a half-hearted smile. "Appreciate it, but we'll figure it out." Ethan left the bakery, his thoughts churning. He had seen men like the Iron Hounds before, thugs who thrived on fear and control. During his time in the Army, he had dealt with insurgent groups that used similar tactics to dominate villages. The methods were the same, whether in a war zone or a quiet Midwestern town. That night, Ethan sat on the porch of his small cabin on the edge of Meadowbrook Forest. The stars were bright overhead, the kind of clear night that had drawn him to this place. But his peace was fractured by the memory of the Connors' faces, fearful, helpless. He couldn't shake the feeling that Meadowbrook had become a different kind of battlefield. Ethan wasn't looking for a fight. He had left that life behind, or so he told himself. But there was a fine line between staying out of trouble and letting injustice flourish. As he nursed a mug of coffee, He thought about the trails he patrolled every day, the people he nodded to in passing, the children who laughed as they explored the forest. Meadowbrook wasn't just a town. It was a community. And though he had tried to keep his distance, Ethan realized he couldn't stand by and let it be consumed by fear. In the distance, the low rumble of motorcycles echoed through the still night. The iron hounds were making their rounds, reminding everyone who held the reins in Meadowbrook. Ethan set his mug down. He had always believed in the motto that had guided him as a ranger: lead the way. Maybe it was time to do just that. The next morning, Ethan rose before dawn, slipping on his uniform and lacing up his boots. His limp was more pronounced in the morning, but he pushed through the pain. He had a route to patrol, and he suspected that today's patrol would be the beginning of something far greater than maintaining trails. As the sun crested the horizon, casting golden light across the fields, Ethan started his day. Meadowbrook might have secrets, but so did he. And he was about to show the Iron Hounds that they had underestimated the quiet park ranger. The battle for Meadowbrook had begun. The Iron Hounds were not your typical biker gang. At first glance, they seemed like any other group of leather-clad outlaws who rode their roaring motorcycles into town, turning heads with their brash confidence. But those who lived in Meadowbrook knew better. The Hounds weren't just a gang. They were a well-oiled machine, operating with the precision of a military unit and the ruthlessness of a crime syndicate. Their leader, Caleb Knox, was the reason for that. Caleb had once been an intelligence officer in the military, a man trained to analyze threats, plan operations, and execute them with cold efficiency. But a dishonorable discharge had ended his career abruptly, and whatever ideals Caleb once had were long buried under layers of bitterness and greed. He had taken his training and turned it toward criminal enterprise, building the Iron Hounds into a force that Meadowbrook couldn't ignore. Unlike other gangs that thrived on chaos, Caleb ran the Iron Hounds like a paramilitary operation. His men were assigned roles: enforcers, scouts, smugglers, and their operations were meticulously planned. They dealt in weapons, drugs, and intimidation, always staying just below the radar of state and federal authorities. Meadowbrook was their latest conquest, chosen for its strategic location near highways that made smuggling easy and its isolation that discouraged outside interference. Ethan Blake knew all of this, though much of it wasn't common knowledge in town. He had seen enough during his military service to recognize the signs. The Iron Hounds weren't a gang of unruly bikers. They were an organized syndicate with a dangerous leader at the helm. It was a crisp autumn morning when Ethan first crossed paths with Caleb Knox. Ethan was walking his usual patrol through the trails when he heard the distant rumble of motorcycles. The sound grew louder, echoing through the forest until it settled near a clearing by the lake. Ethan's instincts told him to investigate. Moving carefully, he approached the clearing, staying low and out of sight. There, parked in a neat formation, were 8 motorcycles. The Iron Hounds had set up camp, their leather jackets glinting in the sunlight as they lounged by the water. Caleb stood apart from the group, his tall frame exuding authority. He was speaking to one of his men, his voice low but commanding. Ethan couldn't make out every word, but the snippets he caught were enough to set him on edge. Next shipment, keep the locals quiet. Ethan frowned. The Hounds weren't just extorting businesses. They were using Meadowbrook as a waypoint for something bigger. As he watched, Caleb turned, his sharp eyes scanning the tree line. Ethan held his breath, staying perfectly still. Caleb's gaze lingered on the woods for a moment before he returned to his conversation. Ethan waited until the gang was distracted, then slipped away as quietly as he had come. Back at his cabin, Ethan pieced together what he had seen. The Iron Hounds were more entrenched than he had realized, and Caleb was more than just a gang leader. He was a tactician. The town's fear wasn't misplaced. If the Hounds had their way, Meadowbrook would become little more than a smuggling hub. Ethan needed more information, but he couldn't act alone. The next day, he visited Marla Torres at the diner. The place was nearly empty in the late afternoon, and Marla was wiping down tables when Ethan walked in. "Ranger Blake," she said with a wry smile. "Twice in 1 week. What's the occasion?" Ethan took a seat at the counter, his tone casual. "Just doing my rounds, Marla. Thought I'd check in." Marla poured him a cup of coffee, her expression softening. "You're worried, aren't you?" Ethan nodded. What can you tell me about Caleb Knox? Marla sighed, leaning on the counter. Not much to tell that you don't already know. He's smart. Too smart. Sheriff Mackey's scared of him, and the rest of us just try to keep our heads down. The hounds don't take kindly to people asking questions. Ethan stirred his coffee thoughtfully. What about the businesses? How many are paying the fees? Almost all of them, Marla admitted. Except Tom Connor, but I don't think he'll hold out much longer. They've got a way of breaking people down. Ethan didn't doubt it. He had seen how fear could hollow out even the strongest people. Thanks, Marla, he said, standing up. Let me know if you hear anything. She gave him a worried look. Be careful, Ethan. Caleb Knox isn't someone you want to cross. Later that night, Ethan sat at his kitchen table, staring at a map of Meadowbrook. He marked the locations of businesses targeted by the Iron Hounds, noting patterns in their movements. It was clear they were consolidating control over the town, but something didn't add up. Their operations were too methodical for simple greed. Ethan's mind went back to the clearing by the lake, to the words he had overheard. Next shipment. What were they moving, and why was Meadowbrook so important to their plans? The answer came the next morning. Ethan was patrolling the forest when he came across fresh tire tracks cutting through the underbrush. They weren't from motorcycles. They were from a larger vehicle, likely a truck. He followed the tracks until they led to an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town. The warehouse had been unused for years, its windows shattered and its roof sagging. But as Ethan got closer, he noticed subtle signs of activity. A newly installed lock on the door, faint footprints in the dirt. He found a vantage point and watched from a distance. Just after sunset, a truck pulled up to the warehouse, flanked by 2 motorcycles. Caleb Knox stepped out of the truck's passenger seat, barking orders to his men. They began unloading crates, stacking them inside the warehouse with practiced efficiency. Ethan's gut told him those crates weren't filled with harmless goods. This was no ordinary gang operation. The Iron Hounds were trafficking something significant, and Meadowbrook was just a piece of the puzzle. Ethan watched until the truck left, then slipped away into the night. Back at his cabin, he wrote down everything he had observed. The Iron Hounds were a threat, but they weren't invincible. They relied on fear and secrecy, and Ethan knew how to exploit both. As he stared at the notes in front of him, a plan began to take shape. Meadowbrook needed someone to fight back, someone who understood how to dismantle an operation like the Iron Hounds. Ethan Blake had spent his life fighting for others. It seemed Meadowbrook was about to find out exactly what that meant. Ethan Blake awoke before dawn, his cabin bathed in the dim light of early morning. The air was crisp, and the forest around him was silent except for the occasional rustle of leaves. Normally, this would have been a time of peace, but Ethan's mind was racing. The events of the past week had revealed the true extent of the Iron Hound's grip on Meadowbrook, and the time for quietly observing was over. As he laced his boots and prepared for his patrol, he thought about the Connors. Their bakery, Sweet Beginnings, was a symbol of resilience, but it was also a target. Ethan had seen it too many times before. Good people crushed under the weight of fear and corruption. This time, he wouldn't stand by and let it happen. Later that morning, Ethan stopped by the diner. The scent of frying bacon and freshly brewed coffee greeted him as he pushed open the door. Marla Torres stood behind the counter, her usual warm demeanor tempered by a weariness that Ethan had come to recognize in Meadowbrook's residence. You look like a man with something on your mind, Marla said as she poured him a cup of coffee. Something like that, Ethan replied, scanning the nearly empty diner. The few customers inside were hunched over their meals, avoiding eye contact as if the weight of the town's troubles had seeped into their bones. Marla leaned closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. What have you found out? Ethan hesitated for a moment before speaking. The Iron Hounds are using that abandoned warehouse near the forest as a hub. I saw them unloading crates last night. Whatever's in those crates, it's big. Marla's brow furrowed. You think it's drugs? Could be, Ethan said, but it feels bigger than that. They're moving with too much precision, like it's part of a larger operation. Marla sighed, glancing toward the window. I don't know what you're planning, Ethan, but be careful. They're not just bullies. They're dangerous. Ethan nodded, finishing his coffee and standing to leave. Thanks for the coffee, Marla. Let me know if you hear anything. Outside, the autumn sun cast long shadows across the town's quiet streets. Ethan's next stop was the library, a small but well-maintained building at the edge of Main Street. Rachel Green, the town librarian, was one of the few people in Meadowbrook who had consistently refused to pay the Iron Hound's protection fees. Her stubbornness had earned her respect and made her a target. Ranger Blake, Rachel greeted him with a small smile as he stepped inside. What brings you here? I need some information, Ethan said, keeping his voice low. About Caleb Knox and the Iron Hounds. Rachel's expression darkened. You're not the first person to ask about them. Most people are too afraid to dig too deep. I'm not most people, Ethan replied. Rachel studied him for a moment, then nodded. She led him to a corner of the library where old records and newspapers were stored. This is everything I have on them. It's not much, but it might give you a starting point. Ethan spent the next hour combing through the records. He learned that Caleb Knox had arrived in Meadowbrook 3 years ago, shortly before the Iron Hounds began their operations in the area. There were whispers of connections to a defense contractor, Atlas Corporation, but nothing concrete. Just as he was about to leave, Rachel approached him with a file in her hands. I almost forgot about this. It's an incident report from before Sheriff Mackey took over. A local deputy tried to investigate Knox. A week later, he resigned and left town. Ethan flipped through the file, his jaw tightening. The report detailed a series of break-ins and vandalism targeting the deputy's home, escalating to anonymous threats against his family. It was a classic intimidation tactic, one Ethan recognized from his time overseas. Thanks, Rachel, he said, tucking the file into his bag. This helps. As he stepped out of the library, Ethan's phone buzzed. It was a text from Tom Connor. They're back? Need help? Ethan's pulse quickened as he headed toward the bakery. When he arrived, he found Tom standing outside, his face pale and his hands shaking. They came this morning, Tom said, his voice trembling. Smashed the front window, left a note. Ethan picked up the crumpled paper from the ground. The message was short and chilling. Pay up or next time. It's worse. Where's your family? Ethan asked. At home, Tom said. I told them to stay there until I figured out what to do. Ethan's gaze hardened. You're not alone in this, Tom. I'll help you. Tom looked at him, a flicker of hope breaking through his fear. Why would you do that? This isn't your fight. It is now, Ethan said firmly. Over the next few days, Ethan began reaching out to others in the community, people he trusted, people who had suffered under the Iron Hound's rule. He started with Jack Carter, a retired police officer turned mechanic. Jack had been one of the few to stand up to the gang in the early days, though it had cost him dearly. They burned down my shop, Jack said when Ethan approached him, but they couldn't take my pride. What do you need? Information, Ethan said. And backup? Jack nodded. You've got it. Ethan's next recruit was Lila Quinn, a tech-savvy teenager who worked part-time at the library. Despite her young age, Lila had a knack for hacking and an unshakable sense of justice. You want me to hack the Iron Hounds? Lila asked, her eyes wide with a mix of excitement and fear. I need to know who they're working with, Ethan explained. Can you do it? Lila grinned. Piece of cake. With his team slowly coming together, Ethan began formulating a plan. The Iron Hounds had thrived on fear and secrecy, but Ethan knew how to dismantle an operation like theirs. He would use their arrogance against them, exposing their activities and rallying the town to stand up for itself. But he also knew the risks. The Iron Hounds wouldn't go down without a fight, and Caleb Knox was no ordinary adversary. Ethan had faced men like him before, ruthless, calculating, and willing to do whatever it took to maintain control. As the sun set over Meadowbrook, Ethan stood outside his cabin, staring into the darkening forest. The battle ahead wouldn't be easy, but he had made his decision. Meadowbrook was his town now, and he would do whatever it took to protect it. Ethan Blake's plan was taking shape. Over the past few days, he had quietly recruited a small but determined group of allies. Each one brought unique skills, and together, they were ready to push back against the Iron Hounds. Still, Ethan knew that winning this battle would take more than courage. It would take strategy, precision, and the element of surprise. One thing was clear. If they were going to dismantle the Iron Hound's operation, they needed hard evidence of their crimes. Without it, the authorities would continue to turn a blind eye, and Meadowbrook's residents would remain trapped under the gang's thumb. The warehouse on the outskirts of town was the key. Ethan was certain that whatever the hounds were hiding in those crates would expose the scale of their operation. But getting inside would require careful planning and impeccable timing. Ethan called his team together one evening at Jack Carter's workshop. The garage was quiet, the scent of motor oil lingering in the air as the group gathered around a table littered with maps, photographs, and notes. "This is the warehouse," Ethan began, pointing to an aerial map. "It's heavily guarded. They've got at least 2 lookouts at all times, and I'd bet there are more inside. Any idea what's in those crates?" Jack asked, leaning back in his chair. "Not yet," Ethan admitted, "but I've seen enough to know it's important. If we can get a look inside, we'll have something solid to take to the authorities. Or use to embarrass them publicly," Lila chimed in, her laptop open and humming. "I've been digging into their communications. It's encrypted, but I've managed to intercept a few messages. There's talk of a shipment going out soon. Something big? Bigger than extortion and intimidation?" Marla asked, her voice laced with skepticism. Ethan nodded. "Yes, this isn't just about Meadowbrook. The Iron Hounds are part of something larger. If we can uncover what that is, we might be able to stop them for good." The group exchanged uneasy glances. The stakes were higher than any of them had anticipated, but no one backed down. "What's the plan?" Jack asked, his tone resolute. Ethan outlined the operation step by step. Lila would use her tech skills to create a distraction by cutting the power to the warehouse. While the lights were out, Ethan and Jack would infiltrate the building and document everything they found. Marla and Tom Connor, who had insisted on helping, would serve as lookouts, monitoring the perimeter and signaling if anything went wrong. "Isn't this a little risky?" Tom asked, his hands fidgeting nervously. "It is," Ethan replied, "but it's also necessary. If we don't take this chance, the hounds will tighten their grip on this town. We can't let that happen." That night, Ethan prepared for the mission with the meticulous focus of someone who had done this before. He checked his gear, a camera for documenting evidence, a flashlight, and a multi-tool, and donned dark clothing that would help him blend into the shadows. As the clock struck midnight, the team assembled at the edge of the forest near the warehouse. The air was heavy with tension, but Ethan's calm demeanor steadied the group. "You all know what to do," he said, his voice low but firm. "Stick to the plan, and we'll be in and out before they even know we were here." Lila set up her laptop under the cover of a thick tree canopy, her fingers flying over the keyboard. "Give me 2 minutes," she whispered. Ethan and Jack crouched in the underbrush, their eyes fixed on the warehouse. A faint glow from the windows indicated that the hounds were inside, and the distant hum of a generator filled the air. "Here we go," Lila whispered. Suddenly, the warehouse was plunged into darkness. The generator sputtered and died, and the faint glow of the windows vanished. "Move," Ethan said, leading the way. He and Jack slipped through the shadows, their footsteps silent as they approached the building. Ethan's combat instincts kicked in, his senses heightened as he scanned for threats. They reached the side door, which was secured with a heavy padlock. Jack produced a set of lockpicks, his movements swift and precise. Within moments, the door clicked open. Inside, the warehouse was a maze of stacked crates and equipment. The air was thick with the smell of oil and dust, and the faint sounds of voices echoed from deeper within. Ethan motioned for Jack to follow as they crept through the aisles, keeping low and out of sight. Ethan stopped beside one of the crates, examining the markings stenciled on its side. Atlas Corporation was printed in bold letters, along with a series of numbers and symbols that looked like military designations. "Atlas," Jack muttered. "That name keeps coming up." "It's a defense contractor," Ethan whispered. "They supply weapons, vehicles, and equipment to the military. If the hounds are working with them, this goes all the way to the top." Ethan pried open the crate with his multi-tool, revealing rows of sleek, black rifles packed in foam. Each one was labeled with serial numbers and a small Atlas logo. "Military-grade weapons," Ethan said grimly. "This isn't just a gang running drugs and extortion. They're arming someone." Jack snapped photos of the crate's contents, while Ethan moved to another. This one contained ammunition, grenades, and even a few high-tech surveillance drones. "Who the hell are they supplying?" Jack asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Ethan shook his head. "I don't know, but we're going to find out." Suddenly, a shout rang out from the far side of the warehouse. "What the hell's going on with the power?" Ethan and Jack froze as footsteps approached. They ducked behind a stack of crates, holding their breath as two iron hounds walked past, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. "We've got to move," Ethan said, signaling for Jack to follow. They retraced their steps, navigating the labyrinth of crates until they reached the exit. Outside, the night was eerily silent, the warehouse still cloaked in darkness. Marla's voice crackled through Ethan's earpiece. "You're clear." No sign of movement outside. Ethan and Jack slipped back into the forest, regrouping with the others at their designated meeting point. "We got it," Ethan said, holding up the camera. "Everything we need to prove what they're doing." The group exchanged a collective sigh of relief, but Ethan's expression remained serious. "This is just the beginning," he said. "Now we have to figure out who they're working with and how to stop them." As the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, the team dispersed, each member returning to their normal lives to avoid suspicion. But they all knew that the battle for Meadowbrook was far from over. Ethan sat on his porch, reviewing the photos on the camera. The crates, the weapons, the Atlas logo, it was all there. The Iron Hounds weren't just a threat to Meadowbrook. They were part of something much larger, something that could put countless lives at risk. Ethan clenched his jaw, his resolve hardening. The Iron Hounds thought they owned Meadowbrook, but they had underestimated the quiet park ranger and his unlikely team. The fight wasn't over. It was only just beginning. The morning after their daring infiltration of the warehouse, Ethan sat at his kitchen table, the stolen camera in front of him. The images on the screen confirmed everything he feared. The Iron Hounds weren't just a nuisance, they were dangerous. The weapons and equipment they were moving could destabilize not just Meadowbrook, but entire regions if they fell into the wrong hands. As the sunlight filtered through his cabin's windows, Ethan dialed Marla's number. She answered on the second ring, her voice tight with worry. "Morning, Ethan. What's going on?" "We need to meet," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "The diner. 10 minutes." When Ethan arrived, Marla, Jack, and Lila were already seated in the back booth. He slid into the seat across from them and set the camera down on the table. "These are the photos from the warehouse," he said, passing the camera around. "Atlas Corporation is involved. Those weapons are military grade. We're not dealing with just a gang anymore." Jack frowned, scrolling through the images. "Atlas Corporation? That's a defense contractor. Why would they be working with the Iron Hounds?" "That's what we need to figure out," Ethan replied. "But it gets worse. Lila, show them what you found." Lila opened her laptop and brought up the intercepted communications she had decrypted. The screen filled with messages, shipment manifests, payment schedules, and encrypted emails. "I traced one of the emails to a high-ranking executive at Atlas," she said. "The Hounds aren't just middlemen, they're part of a larger operation. Someone's using Meadowbrook as a waypoint for smuggling weapons to unknown buyers." Marla's face paled. "This isn't just about our town anymore. This could be international." Ethan nodded. "That's why we can't stop now. We have enough evidence to take this to the authorities. But if Atlas is involved, we need to tread carefully. They've got resources and connections we can't match." "So what's the plan?" Jack asked. "We keep digging," Ethan said. "We need to expose this in a way that makes it impossible for them to cover it up." Lila looked up from her laptop. "I think I can help with that. If I can trace more of their communications, I might be able to find out where the next shipment is going." "Good," Ethan said. "Focus on that. Jack, you and I are going to check out the other businesses they've been targeting. If we can find more connections to Atlas, we'll have a stronger case." Marla crossed her arms. "And what about me? I'm not just going to sit around." Ethan hesitated. He knew how dangerous this was becoming, but Marla's determination was unshakable. "I need you to keep your ears open at the diner," he said. "The Hounds talk when they think no one's paying attention. Anything you hear could be important." Satisfied with the plan, the group dispersed. Ethan and Jack's first stop was Connor's Bakery. The front window had been repaired, but the tension inside was palpable. Tom Connor was behind the counter, his movements stiff and his face lined with worry. "Ranger Blake," Tom greeted as they entered. "What can I do for you?" "We're following up on the hounds," Ethan said. "I need to know if they've made any recent threats." Tom nodded grimly. "They were here 2 nights ago. Said if I didn't pay up, they'd burn the place down." Jack leaned against the counter. "Did they mention anything about the shipments?" "Not directly," Tom said, lowering his voice. "But one of them let something slip. They said the big boss was coming to town soon. Whoever he is, they're scared of him." Ethan and Jack exchanged a glance. This was new. "Did they say when?" Ethan asked. "No," Tom replied, "but it sounded like it's happening soon." As they left the bakery, Jack turned to Ethan. "The big boss. You think it's someone from Atlas?" "Probably," Ethan said. "And if they're coming here, that means Meadowbrook is more important to this operation than we thought." Their next stop was Rachel Green's library. Rachel greeted them with her usual warm smile, but her eyes betrayed her concern. "I've been hearing things," she said, leading them to a quiet corner. "The hounds have been asking about the old railroad tunnels near the edge of town. They've been abandoned for decades, but if someone's using them..." Ethan's mind raced. The tunnels would be the perfect place to store or move contraband without attracting attention. "Thanks, Rachel," he said. "We'll check it out." That evening, Ethan, Jack, and Lila gathered near the entrance to the old tunnels. The overgrown path leading to the entrance was rarely traveled, and the air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decay. "This is definitely the kind of place they'd use," Jack said, peering into the darkness. Lila adjusted her backpack, her laptop tucked safely inside. "Let's just hope there's something worth finding." Ethan led the way, his flashlight cutting through the shadows. The tunnels were cold and silent, the walls covered in graffiti and moss. As they ventured deeper, they found signs of recent activity: discarded cigarette butts, boot prints in the dirt, and faint scuff marks on the walls. They reached a large chamber where the tunnel branched off in several directions. Ethan crouched, examining the ground. "Look at this," he said, pointing to a set of tire tracks. "They've been using carts to move something heavy." Jack found an empty crate pushed into the corner. The markings were faded, but the Atlas logo was still visible. "They're definitely using this place," Jack said. "But for what?" Lila pulled out her laptop, connecting to a portable hotspot. She tapped away at the keyboard, her face illuminated by the screen. "I'm accessing local surveillance feeds," she said. "If they've been coming and going, there might be footage." Ethan and Jack stood watch as Lila worked. After a few tense minutes, she gasped. "Got something," she said, spinning the laptop around. The footage showed a truck entering the area late at night, flanked by motorcycles. The timestamp was from 3 days ago. "Let me guess," Ethan said. "The truck left empty." "Exactly," Lila confirmed. "They're unloading something here." Ethan's jaw tightened. The tunnels were a critical part of the Hound's operation, and now they had proof. "Let's get out of here," he said. "We need to plan our next move." As they emerged from the tunnels, the weight of what they discovered pressed heavily on Ethan's shoulders. The Iron Hounds weren't just a small-town problem anymore. Their operation was bigger, more dangerous, and more connected than anyone in Meadowbrook could have imagined. But Ethan wasn't about to back down. The Hounds thought they owned this town, but they had underestimated the quiet ranger and his growing network of allies. And as the stars blinked into the night sky, Ethan knew that the real battle was only just beginning. The next morning, Meadowbrook felt different. A tense silence had settled over the town, the kind that Ethan Blake recognized from his years in combat. Something big was coming, and everyone seemed to sense it. Ethan was in his cabin reviewing the evidence they'd gathered so far when his phone buzzed. It was a text from Marla. "He's here." Ethan grabbed his jacket and headed for the diner. The town's main street was unusually quiet for mid-morning. When he stepped into the diner, Marla motioned for him to follow her into the kitchen. "He showed up about an hour ago," she whispered. "Black SUV, 2 motorcycles as escorts. They went straight to the warehouse." "Any idea who he is?" Ethan asked. Marla shook her head. "But he's not one of the usual thugs. This guy had an air about him, like he's the one giving orders. Ethan's jaw tightened. This was it, the big boss Tom had mentioned. If this man was tied to Atlas Corporation, he was the key to unraveling the entire operation. Later that afternoon, the team gathered at Jack Carter's workshop. The tension in the room was palpable as Ethan laid out the situation. "The boss is here," he said. "If we're going to stop this, we need to act fast. Whatever they're planning, he's here to oversee it." Lila, seated at the far end of the table, was furiously typing on her laptop. "I've been monitoring their communications," she said. "There's chatter about a shipment leaving tomorrow night. This is their exit plan." Jack crossed his arms. "So we disrupt it. Hit them hard before they can make their move." Ethan shook his head. "Not yet. If we act too soon, we won't have enough evidence to take them down permanently. We need to figure out exactly what they're moving and where it's going." Marla spoke up. "What about the tunnels? We know they're using them to store something." Ethan nodded. "That's our next move. Tonight, we'll recon the tunnels. If we can intercept that shipment, we'll have everything we need." As night fell, the team prepared for their mission. Lila stayed behind at Jack's workshop, her laptop linked to surveillance feeds and local communication networks. Ethan, Jack, and Marla would handle the fieldwork, moving carefully to avoid detection. They parked a mile away from the tunnel entrance and approached on foot, their movements silent under the cover of darkness. Ethan led the way, his flashlight off to avoid giving away their position. When they reached the entrance, Ethan signaled for the others to wait as he scouted ahead. The tunnel was quiet, the faint sound of dripping water echoing through the space. Ethan spotted a faint glow deeper inside. Flashlights. He returned to the group. "They're inside," he whispered. "Stay close and keep quiet." They moved deeper into the tunnel, sticking to the shadows. The light grew brighter, and soon they heard voices, low and muffled but tense. Ethan crouched behind a stack of crates, motioning for the others to do the same. From their vantage point, they could see the big boss, a tall man in a tailored black coat, standing with Caleb Knox and several armed men. "Everything's on schedule," the man was saying, his tone calm but commanding. "The shipment leaves tomorrow. Make sure there are no loose ends." "What about the locals?" Knox asked, his posture stiff. The man's gaze hardened. "They're not your concern. Focus on the shipment. Let me handle the rest." Ethan felt a chill. This wasn't just a gang leader or even a mid-level operative. This man was a professional, someone accustomed to operating in the shadows. Jack leaned closer to Ethan. "Who the hell is that guy?" he whispered. "Atlas," Ethan replied grimly. "Has to be." The group watched as Knox and the others began loading crates onto carts. Ethan snapped photos, documenting every detail, the men, the crates, and the military markings stamped on their sides. "We've got what we need," Ethan whispered. "Let's get out of here." Back at Jack's workshop, the team reviewed the photos. Lila cross-referenced the shipment manifests with her intercepted communications. "This confirms it," she said. "The shipment is heading to a private airstrip outside town. From there, it's going overseas." Marla frowned. "What's in the crates?" "Military weapons," Ethan said. "And from what I've seen, surveillance drones and other tech. This isn't just about money. Whoever's buying this has serious plans." Jack slammed his fist on the table. "We can't let them get away with this." "We won't," Ethan said. "Tomorrow, we intercept the shipment. This ends here." The next morning, Ethan met with Chief Donnelly, the one man in Meadowbrook's law enforcement who hadn't been corrupted or intimidated by the Iron Hounds. Donnelly was hesitant at first, but when Ethan showed him the photos and the evidence Lila had gathered, his resolve hardened. "You've got guts, Blake," Donnelly said. "But if we're going to pull this off, we'll need backup. Do you have anyone you can trust?" Ethan asked. "A few," Donnelly said. "But it's a gamble. If word gets out, we're finished." Ethan nodded. "Then we keep it tight. Just you, me, and my team." That evening, the group prepared for the final showdown. Lila had hacked into the airstrip security system, giving them a real-time view of the area. Marla and Jack loaded their gear into the truck, while Ethan went over the plan one last time. "This is our chance," he said. "We catch them at the airstrip, stop the shipment, and expose everything. No one gets left behind, and no one gets hurt if we can avoid it. What about the big boss? Marla asked. Ethan's expression darkened. I'll handle him. The airstrip was nestled in a secluded valley just outside Meadowbrook, surrounded by dense forest and isolated from the main roads. It was the perfect location for the kind of operation the Iron Hounds and their mysterious partner were running. Ethan and his team arrived just after sundown, parking their truck at the edge of the woods. Lila stayed behind in the vehicle, her laptop open and connected to the airstrip security cameras. Jack and Marla loaded their gear, while Ethan checked his radio, making sure everyone was synced up. This is it, Ethan said, his voice steady but firm. We stop the shipment, get the evidence, and take these guys down for good. Marla adjusted her headset. What about the boss? What if he tries to cut and run? He won't get the chance, Ethan replied. Lila's voice crackled through the earpiece. You've got 3 guards near the main gate and another 2 by the hangar. Cameras are down, so you're clear to move. Let's do this, Ethan said, signaling for the group to advance. The airstrip was eerily quiet as they approached. The glow of floodlights illuminated the tarmac, where a large cargo plane sat idling. Men in dark clothing moved quickly, loading crates from the warehouse onto the plane's ramp. Ethan, Jack, and Marla crept along the perimeter, staying low to avoid detection. When they reached the hangar, Ethan motioned for them to stop. Jack, take out the guards at the gate, Ethan whispered. Marla, you're with me. We'll secure the plane. Jack nodded, moving off toward the gate. Marla followed Ethan as they slipped through the shadows toward the cargo plane. As they approached, Ethan spotted Caleb Knox overseeing the operation. The gang leader barked orders, his voice echoing across the tarmac. Hurry it up. We're on a tight schedule. Ethan clenched his jaw. If Knox was here, the big boss couldn't be far behind. Jack's voice came through the earpiece. Gate's clear. Moving to your position. Copy that, Ethan replied. He and Marla moved closer to the plane, crouching behind a stack of crates. From this angle, Ethan could see the contents of one crate being loaded, high-tech rifles and surveillance drones, all bearing the Atlas logo. Lila, are you seeing this? Ethan whispered. Crystal clear, Lila replied. I'm recording everything. Ethan glanced at Marla. We need to stop that plane from taking off. See if you can find the fuel valves and disable them. Marla nodded and slipped away, her movements silent in the darkness. As Ethan monitored the activity near the plane, a black SUV pulled onto the tarmac. The big boss stepped out, his polished demeanor a stark contrast to the chaos around him. He strode toward Knox, his expression cold and unreadable. Is everything ready? The boss asked, his voice carrying an air of authority. Knox nodded. Almost. We've got the last few crates going in now. The boss scanned the tarmac, his eyes narrowing. Good. Make sure there are no mistakes. If this shipment doesn't reach its destination, it'll be your head on the line. Ethan's grip tightened on his radio. This was the man pulling the strings, the one responsible for everything. Marla, Ethan whispered. Status? Fuel's disabled, she replied. That plane's not going anywhere. Ethan allowed himself a small smile. Good work. Jack, you ready? Ready, Jack replied, his voice steady. Ethan took a deep breath. Lila, cut the lights. The airstrip plunged into darkness as Lila executed the command. Shouts of confusion erupted as the floodlights went out and the plane's engines sputtered. Move, Ethan ordered. Jack opened fire on the guards near the hangar, his rifle's suppressor keeping his shots quiet but effective. Ethan and Marla advanced on the plane, using the chaos to their advantage. Knox shouted orders, trying to regain control of the situation. Get the lights back on. Secure the perimeter. Ethan reached the plane's ramp and fired a warning shot into the air. Drop your weapons. The men loading the crates froze, their hands going up in surrender. Knox, however, wasn't so compliant. He spun toward Ethan, his pistol drawn. Ethan fired first, hitting Knox in the shoulder. The gang leader fell to the ground, clutching his arm and cursing loudly. Stay down, Ethan growled, his weapon trained on Knox. Meanwhile, Marla intercepted the big boss as he tried to retreat to his SUV. She held him at gunpoint, her hands steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. "Don't move," she said. The man raised his hands, his calm demeanor cracking for the first time. "You don't know who you're dealing with," he said, his voice low and menacing. "Maybe not," Marla replied, "but I know enough to stop you." Ethan joined her, securing the man's hands with zip ties. "You're done," he said. "Your operation is over." The boss smirked. "You think this ends with me? There are others, people you can't even imagine. This is bigger than you." Ethan leaned in, his voice cold. "Maybe, but we'll deal with them when the time comes. Right now, you're going to answer for everything you've done." As dawn broke over the airstrip, law enforcement vehicles rolled in. Chief Donnelly and his team quickly secured the area, taking the remaining gang members into custody. Knox was loaded into an ambulance, his face pale but defiant. The big boss was escorted into a squad car, his arrogance replaced with quiet fury. Lila emerged from the truck, her laptop in hand. "I've uploaded everything to secure servers," she said. "The authorities have enough evidence to bury these guys." Ethan nodded, the weight of the night's events settling over him. They had won a major victory, but the fight wasn't over. The man they'd captured was just one piece of a much larger puzzle. As he watched the cargo plane being towed off the tarmac, Ethan knew this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. "Good work, everyone," he said, his voice steady. "But stay sharp. There's more to come." The Iron Hounds had been defeated, but the network behind them was still out there. And Ethan Blake was ready to face it, one battle at a time. In the days following the raid at the airstrip, Meadowbrook began to heal. The Iron Hounds were dismantled, their operations exposed, and their leaders taken into custody. Federal agents flooded the town, combing through the evidence that Ethan and his team had collected. Ethan sat on the front porch of his cabin, sipping his morning coffee. The sun rose over the mountains, casting a warm glow on the town below. For the first time in months, Meadowbrook felt peaceful. But Ethan knew this peace had come at a cost, and the fight wasn't over. Marla arrived a few minutes later, carrying a stack of folders. She dropped them on the porch table and sat beside Ethan. "Morning," she said. "Morning," Ethan replied. "What's all this?" Marla gestured to the folders. "The FBI sent over everything we gathered. Evidence, photos, recordings. They wanted us to know we made a difference." Ethan flipped through one of the folders, his eyes scanning the documents. Each page was a reminder of how far they'd come. "Feels good, doesn't it?" Marla asked. Ethan nodded. "It does. But this is just the start. The guy we took down at the airstrip wasn't the top of the chain." Marla sighed. "You think Atlas is still out there?" "I know they are," Ethan said. "And they won't stop just because we took out one operation." That afternoon, the team gathered at Jack's workshop to review the aftermath. Lila had set up her laptop on the workbench, displaying a map with red dots scattered across the screen. "These are all the locations linked to the Iron Hounds," she said. "Warehouses, drop points, airstrips, most of them tied to Atlas in some way." Jack leaned over the map. "And how many of these have been shut down?" "For so far," Lila replied. "But there are dozens more. This network is massive." Ethan studied the map, his mind racing. "We've disrupted their operations here, but they'll regroup. If we're going to stop them, we need to keep the pressure on." Marla crossed her arms. "That's a big job for a small town team." Ethan looked at her, his expression resolute. "We've already done more than anyone thought we could. Why stop now?" Later that evening, Chief Donnelly stopped by the diner, where the team had gathered for dinner. He carried a large envelope, which he handed to Ethan. "This came from the FBI," Donnelly said. "They wanted you to have it." Ethan opened the envelope and pulled out a letter. As he read it, his brow furrowed. "What is it?" Marla asked. Ethan handed her the letter. "They want me to help with a new task force. One focused on dismantling organizations like Atlas." Marla's eyes widened. "Are you going to do it?" Ethan hesitated. The offer was tempting, but he couldn't ignore the weight of what it would mean. "I'll need to think about it." Jack chuckled. "You've never been one to sit still, Ethan. You were made for this." In the days that followed, life in Meadowbrook began to return to normal. The diner reopened, bustling with regulars who no longer whispered in fear. Jack's workshop was busy again, his work no longer interrupted by the gang's intimidation tactics. But for Ethan, normalcy felt elusive. He spent his mornings on the trails, his afternoons at the diner with Marla and the team, and his nights poring over the evidence Lila had uncovered. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Ethan stood at the edge of town, gazing out at the quiet streets. He thought about everything they had accomplished, the lives they had saved, the town they had protected. Marla joined him, carrying 2 cups of coffee. "Penny for your thoughts?" Ethan took the coffee, a small smile tugging at his lips. "Just thinking about how far we've come." Marla nodded. "And how far we still have to go." Ethan's smile faded. "This isn't over, Marla. Atlas is still out there. But if there's one thing I've learned, it's that even small towns can make a big difference." The next morning, Ethan packed a small bag and met with the team one last time at the diner. "So, this is it?" Jack asked. "For now," Ethan replied. "The task force needs someone who knows how these operations work, someone who's seen it up close." "You're leaving," Lila said, her voice tinged with sadness. "Not for good," Ethan assured her. "I'll be back. But for now, there's more work to do." Marla handed him a small notebook. "For the road," she said. Ethan opened it and smiled. Inside were handwritten notes, reminders of the team's victories and the lessons they had learned. "Thanks," he said. "You better come back in one piece," Marla said, her voice firm but warm. Ethan nodded. "I will." As Ethan drove out of Meadowbrook, he glanced in the rearview mirror. The town was fading into the distance, but he knew it would always be with him. The fight against Atlas was far from over, but Ethan Blake was ready. He wasn't just a ranger or a veteran. He was part of something bigger now, a movement to protect the innocent, expose corruption, and ensure that justice always prevailed. And as the open road stretched out before him, Ethan felt a renewed sense of purpose. This wasn't the end of his story. It was just the beginning.